Hi, and welcome to the 63rd in our series on Middle Eastern and Islamic history. We are going to starting our new discussion on Islamism and Jihadism. We're going to also talk about what those things mean and what the context is. And this presentation goes with last week's presentation in that we're discussing general political trends in the Middle East, rather than, let's say, specific countries or specific in-depth experiences like we've been doing for the last, let's say, 15 episodes or so. All right, the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. And I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective, trying not to bias towards any of the sides in this view. But that said, we should be respectful. This topic concerns the current day and age, and of course, it's going to be very sensitive to certain people in certain ways. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time to your questions, comments, and clarifications. What I'd like to say is that this presentation will be a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll tell you enough to catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you know the basics of what I'm going to talk about, I'll still probably tell you stuff that you didn't know. I also say that there's going to be a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that if I don't cover all my slides, and that's actually incredibly likely tonight, it doesn't matter. At 2 hours, I will stop, and whatever I don't finish will roll over into next week. So that way, you know, and I know that we agreed to only be together for that certain amount of time with new information. That said, if people have questions, comments, I'm more than happy to continue to talk about these issues, talk about these things. Just no new slides will be revealed. When I put dates below a person, if it's a political figure, those are their years of service. If I put below a philosopher or an ideologue, it's their life because they didn't hold any specific office. Now, this, like all of the other entries in this series, will be recorded and will be put up on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page in order to see not only this episode, but all the previous episodes in this series and the other series that we're going to do. We'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. And if you want to see more of our activities, or you really like what you've seen tonight and you want to see more of it, please join our meetup, and you will be able to see all of the presentations, not only that I give, but that other people in our group History, Mostly Ancient Discussions, do give. And while we offer this freely, Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube Premium all do cost money, so we appreciate any donations that you can give in order to help us keep the lights on. All right, so last week, we talked about the relationship in the medieval period between the medieval leaders, be it the secular sultan and the religious Sheikhul Islam. And of course, these titles could differ from country to country in the medieval period. And the Sheikhul Islam in the Ottoman Empire, for example, was a governmental ministry. But in other contexts, it could just be lay power. They could just exist in the general street, but they have an incredible commanding presence. Think, if you want a different context, Jerry Falwell, right, from the American context. Incredibly powerful politically, despite the fact that he had no official office. And within the Islamic system, there was a set of duties that were separated. And so that you ended up with a case where the religious establishment was often the check against the Sultan, and much more connected to the common people because of its creation of qadis, or judgeships, in the local territories, and its position of controlling all the imams who were in all the mosques. And so they had a much greater connection to the local people. And in that way, the religious establishment was itself the moral check in many ways on the capricious power of the Sultan. And we're going to see how that applies when we talk about the different political views that we're going to see later today. For the last 400 years of the Ottoman Sultanate, we're talking about from 1517 until 1926, Constantinople was the seat of the Caliphate. And so the Sultan had this religious duty as the Caliph, but this was a duty that had historically fallen only on, within the Sunni context, the House of Quraysh, which was an Arabian family. It was the family that Muhammad was born into. And it was believed that only a person from that tribe could be caliph. Now, the Turkish sultans were not themselves of that tribe, and it was quite clear that they were. And they didn't even try to challenge this claim. So, but because they had terrestrial power, their view was accepted. With the removal of the Ottoman Caliph, you begin to see a change in this policy. One of the things that we talked about, right, as a fundamental piece in understanding medieval states as well, and we need to remember this, is that the difference between a medieval state and a modern state at a fundamental level is that a medieval state is one with attenuated power structures. The Sultan has complete power, perhaps you couldn't believe, but once you get to the level below, the governors of the various provinces, and below them, the lords of various estates, and below them, on and on, each of these has a certain degree of local power because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to communicate, it's difficult to do all of these things. And so there's a degree of tribute and trust that exists between the different layers, and that in turn creates power structures at each level of governance. In a modern state, the government in the capital city is the government, and they control all of the lower areas. They control the taxes and the monetary supply, and accordingly, they are able to institute unitary power without the need of corroborating structures, of help in the local provinces. If they don't like a person in power, they can replace them in the local areas. That's not something that was easily doable in the medieval state. And so this degree of centralization fundamentally changes the roles of the different entities. What we end up seeing, right, when we talk about governments that exist in the modern period, is that we see governments that have said, all right, we had a check and a balance with the Sultan and the Sheikh al-Islam. What can we do with this balance between the secular leader and the religious leader? Well, we don't need a balance anymore. We don't need the religious leader to justify the legitimacy of the secular leader, and we don't need the secular leader to protect the physical viability of the religious leader. We can choose one and have a unified system that is more likely to progress us into the modern age, into the Enlightenment age that the Europeans have talked about. And 4 of these answers said, we keep the Sultan, we keep the secular ruler, and we get rid of the religious ruler. That's the liberals, the ethnic nationalists, the border nationalists, and the Arab socialists. And we talked about the first 3 last week. The last one, the Islamists made the opposite argument. They said, let's keep the religious leader. We don't need the secular leader. The religious leader can take care of all secular governance as well. And they are the ones who will support the idea of an Islamic theocracy, that there should be some rule by Muslims, and similar to pan-Arabs who are talking about a pan-Arab identity, regardless of the nation in which they live, they're still Arabs, as long as they speak Arabic. There's a pan-Muslim identity, that you are a Muslim regardless of where you live. And notice how in this case, Muslim is almost an ethnic term. That it's not about what religion a person believes in their heart. It's about how they're identified from a national perspective. And so you can see this almost like the way that people talk about Catholics or Protestants in Ireland. It doesn't matter about what they truly believe in their heart of hearts. It matters what family they're born to and what religion they are outwardly professed to be. So I want to clarify a few terms before I get into this, because when we talk about theocracy, things can get a little naughty. So the first thing is that we need to separate people from the religion, from the political ideology. So the people we're talking about are Muslims, right? Muslims believe in a certain faith. That faith is Islam, and they have certain prayer rituals, they have certain holidays and festivals. That's a Muslim. Muslims belong to that religion of Islam, right? And we've talked about, especially in episode 1, what are the beliefs of Islam and how does that work? And finally, you have political ideologies. So Islamism is the belief that Islamic law should be the governing law of a modern nation. And Jihadism is Islamism, but in a revolutionary framework. In fact, much of this revolutionary framework can be seen as similar to the revolutionary framework in Arab socialism, or more historically, in the framework of communism, that unless you have a complete revolution, a military revolution, you're not going to be able to create this Islamist state. Now, that revolution itself, that violence used to cause that revolution, is called jihad, right? They're using the term from Islam referring to sacred war. If we're talking specifically about lesser jihad, right? Jihad al-Asghar. This term typically means holy war of some kind. And jihadism argues that this jihad can be understood in the form of a revolution against the current political system in order to establish an Islamist state. I also want to clarify that in Arabic, these terms are different. A lot of people try to say that Islamism is Islam, and these two are the same. It's not actually the case. Islam in Arabic is Islam. Islamism is Islamawiyya. So it's a different term, and it has specific political connotations. I also want to point out that a lot of people are of the view that Islamists are extremely radical or they're very religious. That's not necessarily the case. The definition of an Islamist is somebody who wants to legislate Islam in a modern state. It doesn't have to be a religious individual by extreme standards. It doesn't have to be radical in their approach to religion, although a number of Islamists absolutely are, especially when you get to jihadists. But these terms are not synonymous. You can have a deeply conservative Muslim, a deeply religious Muslim, who is not an Islamist. And we've talked about a number of deeply religious Muslims, like Ali Abdul Razak, who was a staunch liberal who believed in secularism, specifically because, in his view, there was no good argument for mixing religion with the state. And so it's a question about secularism rather than a question of personal religiosity. And I just want to draw this a little bit clearer. So I want to introduce you to two individuals. On the left, we have Said Jamaluddin. He is an Iraqi Shiite marja, or a cleric. And he studied in Qom in Iran for 8 years under the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime. While he was living in Iraq, he protested the banning of the Karbala pilgrimage, which is an annual Shiite religious festival that Sunnis do not observe. And Saddam Hussein, as a Sunni ethno-nationalist, banned this pilgrimage. But he protested against that. So you can see the devotion that he has to his religious heritage. And he even migrated to Dubai, where he began evangelizing Shiite Islam. And on the flip side, I want to introduce you to the Egyptian Abdul Monem Abul Futuh. And Abul Futuh was a graduate of Cairo University's medical college, and he's also a graduate of its law school. He even had a debate with Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president at the time, that Abul Futuh was in college, over Sadat's restrictions on freedom of speech. He wanted increased freedom of speech. And in addition, he's received a master's degree in medicine. He is a practicing doctor. But the one on the left, Said Jamaluddin, is an ardent secularist. He does not believe that there should be any connection between religion and the state. In his view, this is actually to protect religion. He sees the state as a corrupting influence on the purity of religion, and that religions that are incorporated into states actually have the adverse effect. Conversely, Abdul Monem Abul Futuh was the candidate supported by the Muslim Brotherhood until the Muslim Brotherhood ran their own candidate in 2012 for the Egyptian election to the prime ministry, to the presidency of Egypt. So here he's being supported by Sheikh Qaradawi, who is one of the leaders, we could say, of the Sunni Muslim world, because he is the leader of Al-Azhar University in Egypt, one of the centers of Islamic law and education around the world. So we now want to trace the development of Islamism. So we go back to this Nahda, to this Renaissance, and we talked about how there was a division between, on one side, those who were nationalists, Arab nationalists or border nationalists, and on the other side, you had the Islamic modernists. So we're going to follow the Islamic modernist track again. And the Islamic modernists believed that secularism should not be supported, and that Islam itself was a system that supported the development of science, culture, and rationality, freedom of the press, freedom of thought, all these kinds of things. But the state should be religious, and that religious center would guide its moral influence and belief. We also get at the same time this view of Arab exceptionalism that is based on the fact that the Quran and the Islamic religious beliefs are particularly special, right? We talk about Al-Kawakibi, who promoted this idea. And we talked about how Islamic modernism ultimately failed to address the rise of imperialism and the removal of the caliphate by the Turks. There was no longer this unifying central Muslim influence in government, and you ended up with a number of imperialist secular projects that were deeply hurtful to the lives and aspirations of many Arabs. And so a lot of the ulama, or the religious scholars, did what the ulama in Algeria did, which is that they began to withdraw from politics as an organized opportunity, and they decided to be the social welfare systems in many cases of their countries to demonstrate the moral influence of Islam. Now, this is not something that was totally alien to them either. During the period of the Ottoman Empire, religious scholars had formed what were called waqf, or land trusts, that had a charitable nature. You had all kinds of donations to the poor. You had them setting up schools. This was intensified, certainly, by the ulama in Algeria during the 1930s and 40s. But this general kind of activity that they embraced was not unique. This was very traditional. What's surprising is what happened to the Islamic modernists. And some of those Islamic modernists, especially following Rashid Reza, began to say the issue at a fundamental level that we're seeing with the fall of the caliphate, with the rise of imperialism, and all of these degradations in the life of Muslims, is that there's too little religious influence on government. There's too little of a check on the capriciousness of either a secular tyrant or a foreign power. And so accordingly, the moral core of the Islamic world needs to be reconstituted, as opposed to seeking out secular governments that would be morally upright. And so we really have to begin by codifying what these thinkers understood and how they began to articulate the idea of Islamism. So Hassan al-Banna comes chronologically first, and he's the founder of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, or the Muslim Brotherhood, which started in Egypt and has spread to numerous countries already. Now, one of the things that Hassan al-Banna had to struggle with is that Muslim had historically been a religious identity. It was an identity that was concretized through acts of faith. And his primary duty, his primary goal, was to unify Muslims as an ethnic group, or Islam as an ethnic identifier. And so you can see here, Islam does not recognize geographical boundaries, nor does it acknowledge racial and blood differences, considering all Muslims as one nation. He uses ummah, the religious language, for the nation of the Muslims, but here he's using it in a secular political context. They are one nation. They should be one country. The Muslim Brethren, or the Muslim Brotherhood, consider this unity as holy and believe in this union, striving for the joint action of all Muslims and the strengthening of the brotherhood of Islam, declaring that every inch of land inhabited by Muslims is their fatherland. Notice this hybridization of religious language and national language. This is the key of what he's doing. He's trying to create a Muslim that can serve as a political basis for the institution of an Islamic government, right? Eventually, this will be codified into Islamism, but at his point, that ideology had not yet been constructed in its own clarity. They want to reestablish the caliphate, right? The caliphate, in the view of Hassan al-Banna and a lot of other religious scholars, was a primarily religious government, in the sense of As opposed to the secular governments, it would have a strong religious leader and would have a strong moral center. Hassan al-Banna is seen as the founder of numerous Muslim Brotherhood chapters around the world. His devotion to Palestine in particular during his life was extremely high. And he convinced a number of Egyptians to fight in the Israeli War of 1948 under the Muslim Brotherhood banner. The inculcation of the Brotherhood that came to exist in the territory of the former Mandate of Palestine was termed Hamas. And so Hamas is a direct successor of the Muslim Brotherhood, just as the Muslim Brotherhood continues to exist in Egypt and a number of other countries. In fact, you can see in the lower left-hand side, Hamas putting on a celebration for Hassan al-Banna on the anniversary of his, I believe it's his birth. Since Islamism is a philosophy that is about Muslims as an ethnic group, it would make sense that a number of the thinkers and contributors to the idea exist outside of the Arab world, because most Muslims don't live in the Arab world. The Arab world is roughly 20% of the world's Muslim population. If you add in Iran and Turkey, that might rise to about 25-30%. But still, the Indian subcontinent is responsible for about 50% of the world's Muslim population. So it would be deeply surprising if Indian Muslims were not part and parcel of this. And so I'm focusing on Abu al-Ala al-Maududi. Now, Maududi is a Quran exegetical scholar, and his books on the Quran and its understanding exist outside of an Islamist context. They certainly are part of his ideology and fed into his Islamist beliefs, but his books are accepted even by non-Islamist Muslims as being jurisprudentially correct. And so I want to take a look at his jurisprudential perspective, because here he does a lot of the legwork in formulating jihad as a sacred form of warfare to institute an Islamic state. So he talks about here, Islam is a revolutionary faith that comes to destroy any government made by man. Islam doesn't look for a nation to be in a better condition than another nation. Islam doesn't care about the land or who owns the land. The goal of Islam is to rule the entire world and submit all of mankind to the faith of Islam. Any nation or power in this world that tries to get in the way of that goal, Islam will fight and destroy. In order to fulfill that goal, Islam can use every power available, every way it can, to be used to bring worldwide revolution. This is jihad. So notice that he's described in many ways language that if you replace with Control F, right, Islam with communism, it would work perfect in terms of that. But he uses that final sentence, this is jihad, to recapitulate this entire idea of revolutionaryism. Right, in the Turkish context, we saw this as inkılapçılık, right, revolutionaryism, in referring to jihad. And so not only is this revolution part of a political worldview, this revolution is now religiously validated. And so it creates a very strong link between these ideas. Maududi was himself the founder of an organization called Jama'at-e-Islami, and meaning the Islamic Society. And this is the largest Islamist political party in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It is a party that has been responsible, especially in Pakistan, for the institution of numerous Islamist laws. We'll talk about Zia al-Haq and the Islamization of Pakistan, which Jamaat-Islami was a huge part in advocating. He was also a huge supporter of what's called Islami Hukumrani, or Islamic governance. And in his view, the moral nature of Islam allowed it to govern in a more acceptable and holistic way. And so he actively sought to integrate into governmental policy and wrote on numerous occasions to different governments in the Islamic world in order to promote the creation of legal policies that would reflect religious norms. Now, The most important individual in Islamist thought is Sayyid al-Qutb. In fact, there are those who say that the proper term, instead of Islamawiyya for Islamism, should be Kotobia, Kutubism, because of how seminal he is to the thought. And I want to put you sort of in the mindset of Sayyid al-Qutb and where he's coming from and what he's trying to argue about. In order to understand this passage, you have to understand that Qutb came to Colorado in the mid-1940s, late 1940s, just after World War II. And he was staying with a host family during this was a university study abroad. And he was invited to a school dance in a church basement. And this is his reaction to seeing the children there getting a little drunk, a little tipsy, dancing in perhaps a more sexually explicit way than he was used to growing up in rural Egypt. So this should really capture his mentality. And I think it'll also explain why he has such an antipathy towards secularism and Western governance. Some Americans call this freedom from hypocrisy and facing the truth, but there is a fundamental difference between freedom from hypocrisy and freedom from the components of humanity that separate man from animals. Humanity in its long history was not unaware that sexual desires are normal and true, but it consciously or unconsciously struggled to control them, escaping its slavery and distancing themselves from its primitive levels. Yes, it is a need, so why does humanity shy away from realizing its need? Because it feels inherently that controlling such desires is a testament to freedom from slavery, and going beyond the first rungs of humanity's evolution, and that a return to the freedom of the jungle is a gripping slavery and a relapse to the first primitive levels. So basically, nobody danced with him. But on a more serious note, we can see here that his fundamental view is that the United States is in a state of moral ignorance and moral apathy. He compares this in many ways to the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance as defined by Muslims prior to the existence of the Islamic religion in Arabia, where Arabians committed many moral depravities, and those moral depravities were remedied through the implementation of Islam as a ruling faith. And these Americans are part of a crumbling system. They are part of a system that allows them to resort to their base animal instincts to enter this kind of jahiliyyah and this kind of ignorance. And accordingly, that is what will come to Egypt if Egypt embraces the values of Western secularism. That's the fundamental point that he makes in this passage of The America I Have Seen. He also argues strongly against the international order. He says here, warfare in Islam is something for which Islam deserves to be praised, not condemned. The defeatists should fear Allah, lest they distort this religion and cause it to become weak on the basis of the claim that it is a religion of peace. Yes, it is a religion of peace, but in the sense of saving all mankind from worshipping anything other than Allah and submitting all of mankind to the rule of Allah. This is the religion of Allah, not the ideas of any person or the product of human thought, so that those who promote it should feel ashamed to state its ultimate goal, which is that all religion should be for Allah alone. When there's a divine system and law, and alongside it there are human systems and laws, then the matter is fundamentally different, and the divine law has the right to remove the barriers and free people from enslavement to human beings. So a lot of things to talk about here. The first one is that he redefines the idea of the religion of peace, which Islam typically argues that it is. In his definition, he's saying that it is the religion of peace because it will create peace through the sublimation of all others. That any system that doesn't accord with the political needs of Islam, that doesn't fit those strictures, will be a system that will be replaced, and its advocates will be removed. Therefore, there will be peace because there will be one form of thought. We also have the illusion here between worshiping God and being part of a political system. That the acceptance of a political system is itself a religious act. And this goes along with the religious legitimacy given to revolutionary thought in the jihad that we talked about from Maududi, and builds on that in terms of the propitiation of the very state is a religious act. And finally, that the rulers of the state, as long as they're ruling based on Islamic edicts, are actually ruling a superior system, one that is so superior, in fact, that the laws of international politics should not constrain it, and that it should be able to overwhelm and destroy any states that don't fall into that paradigm. And the last quote basically points out exactly what I just mentioned at the beginning, which is that in his view, religion, especially Islam, is a political system. And so he elides the personal beliefs of people and perhaps the communal actions in a mosque to the political actions that we would see in other places. So now that we've developed Islamism in terms of its organization, we're going to see a number of patterns breaking out across the Middle East. We've already talked about how the Arab socialists were leading to a system that was extremely unstable. And it was unstable because they couldn't guarantee the economic success that they had based their legitimacy on. And they couldn't defeat Israel, which was the military objective that they based their legitimacy on. In contrast to the Islamists, who are basing their legitimacy on the religious beliefs of the population, the Pan-Arabists had based their legitimacy on the fulfillment of a Pan-Arab dream, right, the unification of the various Arab states, and based on the implementation of socialist reforms. They achieved neither. And so what ended up happening was that you were left with a number of unstable governments. At the same time, Arab socialist governments were not uniparty states. Many of them were close to that, but they were not uniparty states. There were a number of independents almost always in these governments. There were independents who were border nationalists, and there were independents who were liberals. And there were independents who were more Islamist in their leanings. In fact, if we talk about Iraq in 1958, which had its first coup, the July Revolution, July 14th Revolution, a number of Pan-Arabists, Nasrists, came to power in their coup, but Abdul Karim Qasim was a border nationalist, and therefore he had to subvert a 1959 coup d'etat attempt by Nasser to remove him from power. The point I'm saying is that these groups existed in coalitions, and the Nasrists themselves would launch a coup against him in 1963, which led to Iraq being run by a number of Nasserist military generals at that point. But the one group that never aligned with the Arab socialists, never voted with them, consistently withdrew its support from the government, were the Islamists. Hands down, every time the Arab socialist governments wanted something of the Islamists, they refused. And they suffered for it. Nasser's regime was incredibly discriminatory towards the Islamists. They were jailed in large numbers. And it didn't help matters when Said Qutb himself tried to assassinate Nasser. But they would not grant these systems legitimacy, and the people remembered that. The next part is that Islamist groups, because they were able to connect to mosques and the large religious network that existed in most of these states, were able to establish far denser connectivity, far more brand awareness from a political perspective than any of their competitors. Ethno-nationalists, border nationalists, and liberals have to strike out on their own in order to promote their brand. But the creation of the religious system, by the way, a system that Arab socialists didn't want to attack because of how negative it would have looked to the majority of the population, the Islamists were able to spread their message. And their message was often, Islam huwa al-hal, Islam is the solution to everything, right? Because in their view, the issue with the state is fundamentally its lack of a moral core. And when that moral core is reasserted, that will create a new state. And so that begins to have long-term effects and dividends. And the final part is that the West begins to see the Islamists as a way to remove socialist aligned governments, communist aligned governments, or governments that have a possibility of falling into one of those two camps. Because if there's one thing that Islamists can agree upon, it's that communists need to be destroyed as well. Communism is an atheist political perspective and one that is deeply antagonistic towards religious faith. And so Islamists see themselves locked in a struggle with them, even more so than they see themselves locked in a struggle with the West and secularism. Because in the West, there is a certain degree of religious tolerance and a certain degree of morality. So a number of different things start happening in the 1960s and 1970s that begin to shift power away from the Arab socialists and towards the Islamists. The first one is that the Saudi government begins to invest. And there's several reasons for this. The first one is that they have excess capital. Now that the United States is buying significant portions of their oil, they have wealth beyond what they need to spend on their own people. So that's number one. But it's not even the most important one. The most important one is that the Saudi government is a medieval style government with the Sultan, in this case, the king of Saudi Arabia, and the Shaykhul Islam, in this case, the Wahhabist clerics. In the Saudi system, the king is the moderate one, the more liberal one, and the Wahhabist clerics are the more conservative element of the government. Now, if the king wants to retain Western expertise in drilling for oil, he needs to keep the country at least somewhat less conservative than it would otherwise be. And this is sort of a strange thing to say because most people know Saudi Arabia as being one of the most conservative countries in the world. But if it were truly up to the Wahhabist clerics, it would be even more conservative than it is. The king was a secularizing influence to the extent that we can say that. And so the direction and energies of the Wahhabist clerics had to be focused elsewhere than on criticizing the actions of the king. In fact, in 1979, there was a revolt within Saudi Arabia by more conservative individuals who thought the king of Saudi Arabia was too modernist, too liberal, which should show you just how reasonable that fear was from the kings of Saudi Arabia. And so they directed the Wahhabist clerics' attention towards the promulgation of Wahhabism outside of Saudi Arabia and the promotion of Saudi religious leadership in countries outside of Saudi Arabia. So how does this manifest? The first one is that they start building mosques. From 1962 until today, 1,500 mosques and counting have been built all across the world. One particular example is the Ibrahim al-Ibrahim Mosque in Gibraltar. Considering that there are only 4,000 Muslims in all of Gibraltar, the mosque does seem a little gargantuan. And in fact, it took £5 billion to build, completely donated by the Saudi government. The Saudis also built institutions in order to educate Muslims from around the world and provide scholarships. In particular, you can see the scholarships to go to Saudi Arabia, which are quite commonly used by Pakistani students and by Indonesian students. In fact, so many Indonesian students have gone to the Saudi educational apparatus that within Indonesia, Islam has broken into two general strands. The traditional Islamic strand, which is the type of syncretic or quasi-syncretic Islam that existed in Indonesia for centuries, and modernist Islam, which is the beliefs promulgated primarily by the Saudis, connected with those views originally from Indonesia and weeding out those syncretic elements and instituting instead more modernist Saudi elements. Despite this, and this allowed even further justification for such investment, there were Nasserist groups in Arabia. And we talked about how, for example, in 1969, there was an attempted coup to institute a Nasserist government and create the Republic of Arabia. This modernist strain in Indonesia has changed Indonesian politics. They're the reason, for example, that Aceh, that region in the northwest of the island of Sumatra, has its own Islamist government separate from the government in Indonesia. It has a high degree of autonomy because of how religious the population has become over the last few decades. In many cases where you had a more syncretic or a more tolerant version of Islam that had grown up alongside other religions and other traditions, this Saudi investment and influence has pushed that group to become more religious, more intolerant, and more modernist than their religion had traditionally been. The next piece is Turkey. Now, Turkey was a secular republic, but that didn't stop Islamist ideas from percolating in Turkey. The most prominent advocate of these things is Necmettin Erbakan, not to be confused with current Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So Erbakan formed 6 political parties in Turkey, each one in sequence because the Turkish government kept banning them. Islamism is illegal in Turkey, according to the constitution. Now, he created an organization outside of those political parties to serve as a youth organization, to serve as a values center of an organization, and in order to create community. And he called this Milli Görüş. His view was to integrate Islamism into the government of Turkey. And he was able to do this, except not in Turkey, because in Turkey it was illegal. But lest we forget, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a major rebuilding that was going on in Europe as a result of World War II and the destruction that war had wrought. And so hundreds of thousands, today millions in terms of their descendants, of Turkish migrants came to the Netherlands, Germany, to other countries in Western Europe in order to help rebuild. The expectation was that they would be there for a little bit and then go back. But they ended up putting down roots and setting up families. And in those areas, there wasn't a strong sense of community because these immigrants had come from all over Turkey. They didn't know each other. They had no institutions that they brought with them because they were workers. And so Milli Görüş was able to see this opportunity and create centers. You can see this is in the city of Kerpen in Germany. This is the Islamic community of Milli Görüş. At that time, it was being investigated by the police. But these institutions operate in Western Europe because in Western Europe, there is freedom to have theocratic political associations, which don't exist in Turkey. Now, you can see in terms of the Islamism and their philosophy, it tends to be a little bit less clear than the dictates of Maududi or Said Qutb, but you can see in his oath that they're trying to establish a new world order, that they will achieve victory for the believers in terms of overthrowing the current government and instituting an Islamic government. You can also see that it's expansionist in the sense of they'll create a greater Turkey, which is in line with the pan-Islamic ideal as well. Now, during the same time, we've sort of alluded to this, but we should be a little bit clearer. Israel was incredibly successful in destroying the legitimacy of the pan-Arab movement. And in fact, in 1979, by making peace with Egypt, with Sadat, the direct successor of Gamal Abdel Nasser, they shattered the Arab League, which was the sort of the UN of the Arab world. Egypt was removed not only from its leadership of the organization, but from the organization entirely. It would only come back later. And Israel itself wanted to dictate the direction of future engagement with the Arab world. And the dominant movement, of course, in the Arab world in the 1960s was Arab socialism. And so they directly targeted it by giving more freedom to Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which became Hamas. Now, Israel, it's unclear whether Israel ever directly provided funding to Hamas, but there are a number of things that we do know about the relationship. The first one is that in the 1970s, Israel gave permission to a number of sheikhs who were affiliated with Hamas to build Islamic universities in the areas of Gaza that were, because Gaza was under Israeli control throughout the 1970s. And so you can see the Islamic University of Gaza, which was built in 1979 by Hamas. And Hamas was also allowed to establish community centers and other schools. We don't know how often this has happened, but we know that in 1984, that Israel discovered a cache of weapons that Hamas possessed, and they allowed Hamas to keep those weapons. They returned the cache to Hamas. We also have knowledge that Hamas had high-level contacts within the Israeli government. Yitzhak Rabin, for example, who would become prime minister of Israel in the 1990s, maintained relations with Hamas up until 1989. So why was Israel in this position of supporting Hamas, given that Hamas was an organization that, from its very inception, and made no secret of it, wanted to destroy the Jewish state? Israel saw it as a foil to the Palestinian Liberation Organization headed by Yasser Arafat. And as long as that organization was more powerful than Hamas, the infighting was something that Israel could use to its advantage to weaken the negotiating position of the PLO. And so that would help it buy time in terms of the ability to gain strength. And there was no expectation that Hamas would ever prevail over the PLO. But of course, as we know today, that's not the case. The next thing that led to the rise of Islamism happened outside of the Middle East. It happened in Pakistan. And as we talked about, you had Maududi and his Jamiat-e-Islami, his Islamist political party, and they supported coup leader Mohammad Zia al-Haq in his overturn of Benazir Bhutto's elected government of Pakistan. Now, we have to point out that Pakistan was founded by Muhammad Ali Jinnah as an Islamic republic. But that term Islamic Republic was understood by Jinnah to be exclusively an ethnic term. You can see a speech that he gave in 1948 saying, "The great majority of us are Muslims. Consequently, we have a special and a very deep sense of unity. But make no mistake, Pakistan is not a theocracy or anything like it." Right? He accedes to that idea of Muslim ethnic identity, but he doesn't accede to the belief of Muslim political identity. Zia al-Haq redefines this understanding and reasserts it in an Islamist perspective. There are several things where this comes to the fore. The first is that he begins to impose blasphemy laws that are specifically targeted to statements that are opposed to what Islam believes. He also creates what are called hudud punishments, which are punishments to the extremists, and he makes a number of Islamic crimes like zina, which is usually translated as prostitution or fornication, illegal. He also includes a number of corporal punishments in that hudud punishment group. He gives more power to local qadis, these the judges that had existed in Pakistan after independence in sort of a semi-legal role. They now became part of the government, and in fact, he founded the Shari'a courts that officially made Pakistan an Islamic Republic in the religious understanding of that, not just in the ethnic identifier perspective. And so he created an Islamist country. In fact, Pakistan, after it had done this, received support from the United States. Pakistan was already receiving American support, but it continued to do so because it's opposition to India, which was within the Soviet sphere, or perceived to be, despite it being a, quote, non-aligned nation. It was considered to be more Soviet, and therefore Pakistan was seen as a possible counterweight to that from the United States political administration. See a wider view from the United States, where they want to create a set of states that will hold back the influence of the Soviet Union, the Red Menace. And they don't see that coming from the secular politicians, especially since socialists tend to be more Soviet aligned anyway. And you can see governments that are controlled by socialists on this map in that sort of light pinkish coral. And so the United States believed that it needed a green line to connect with US allies, Pakistan and Turkey, and connect those areas to prevent the expansion of communism into the Middle East. One particular opportunity arose after the Saur Revolution. So Afghanistan's monarchy was overthrown in several successive coups, the final one being the Saur Revolution. And in April 1978, the rebels declare the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan a Soviet satellite country. And this country immediately comes under attack from its own dissident elements. And so the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to support this now client state. The United States is deeply afraid of Afghanistan turning communist, and so it decides to support the local rebel groups there. And when it sees those rebel groups, none is more organized or more developed than the Mujahideen, who are jihadists, right? These are Islamists who believe in violent revolution to overthrow the previous government. And so you have Reagan meeting with these Mujahideen to discuss the war and funding. Eventually, the United States is able to help the Mujahideen through the conflict and overthrow the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and establish in 1991 the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is the Taliban-ruled country. Now, not all the Mujahideen became Taliban, but all the Taliban trace their ideological origins to these Mujahideen. Iran was a similar story in where Iran had had its own quasi-socialist revolution in 1951, where the Shah fled the country and Mohammad Mossadegh was able to nationalize the country's petroleum, and that was undone by the West in 1953 in Operation Ajax. Following that point, resentment towards the Shah continued to increase, and the West was not an ally in seeing the democracy needs or desires of the people. And so the people looked for alternative sources. They went, some of them to the left, to the communists, like the Tudeh Party, a number of feminist groups, labor unions, and other groups on the left. But by far the group with the single largest reach, especially in the rural areas where you had a long tradition of mosque culture, was, of course, the Ayatollahs, the religious clerics. And so what ends up happening is that in 1979, after the Shah abdicates in the face of large-scale protests, Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran, and the Western powers debate what to do. Before the Shah abdicated, the Western powers agreed that they couldn't keep him in power. They couldn't launch another coup. It was non-viable. And in fact, it may well be better if the Islamists succeed, because if the Islamists succeed, then the communists can't. And so they agreed not to interfere and permit, in a certain way, Iran to develop along an Islamist path, which is exactly what happens. There were a number of more secular individuals in the government between February and November of 1979, led by Mehdi Bazargan, but Khomeini's attack on the US embassy led Bazargan and a number of his supporters to resign their posts in the government, allowing the Islamists to have a full and complete takeover. Seeing these kinds of revolutions led to what I call the Caudiozation, right? Becoming like military general governments in much of the Middle East. Two prominent examples are Egypt, which was ruled by Caudillos from 1970. Well, I mean, you could even say from 1952, right, with the Free Officers Movement until 2011, and that has returned since 2013 with al-Sisi. and Syria, which has been ruled since 1971 by these caudillo governments. And one important point to make with respect to these caudillo governments is that despite the fact that their antecedents were Arab nationalists, and both of them featured people who had fought in the Six-Day War or other wars, they didn't stand for the values of Arab socialism anymore. They stood strictly for the need to control control the territory and maintain order. They also began to allow private property again. They began to move back towards the right wing, and they were willing to have a view towards rapprochement with the West. Egypt under Anwar Sadat improved relations with the United States through his Camp David Accords with Israel, and Hosni Mubarak was effectively supported by the United States throughout the entirety of his reign. Hafiz al-Assad had better relations with the United States than some of his predecessors, but he leaned more towards the Soviet sphere. Regardless, he had more of a rapprochement towards the West than a number of the governments that preceded him in Syria, which tended to look with alarm at both the West and the East. But all of these governments agreed that the Islamists cannot be allowed to take power, and the revolutions that have been taking place, for example, in Iran, were incredibly scary to them, leading to large-scale repression towards the Islamists in their own countries. Now, getting power is the first part, but now the rubber hit the road, and the Iranians had to determine how exactly they were going to implement their political philosophy, which is called Vilayat-e-Faqih, governance of the jurist, because now they actually had a government. So there are a few things to point out. It's not that Shiite clerics had been absent from Iranian governance before. Mohammad Bakr Majlisi was probably the first one to really create a government ministry for Shiite clerics, and he forbade a number of different things, some of them which are rather silly, like he banned the flying of kites, and he also banned the consumption of coffee. But it shows that there was a tradition, at least in a certain sense, of Shiites ruling. And even in the creation of the first Majlis after the 1905 revolution, all of the leaders of the different divisions of the parliament, be they liberal, moderate, or royalist, were coming from a clerical background. Taghi-Zadeh was on the liberal side, had been trained as a cleric, even though he was an ardent secularist and lived his life relatively non-religiously. Behbehani, who was one of the leading moderates, as well as Tabatabai, these individuals were moderate, and they also refused to legislate from Islam. Only Fazlullah Nuri in the royalist group would be, in today's lights, an Islamist, although he didn't use that term. So there wasn't a lot of precedent for this, and in fact, the majority of Shiite clerics throughout history had been very resistant towards taking political power on their own. For example, Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Hassan Ashirazi, despite the fact that he had significant power on the street, he was able to issue fatwas that were followed by even the highest levels of individuals within the Iranian government at the time. He never took a political office of his own and never created his own laws as such. And the Shiite resistance towards power has a lot to do with the fact that almost every time power had been created, it had been used to repress Shiites and their traditions. So now, with the governance of the jurist, Vilayat-e-Faqih, Iran had to reimagine how it would structure everything. And so we end up seeing a policy of power projection. We see Islamism as a revolutionary action, similar to what we've seen in other contexts. And Iran begins to attempt to coerce other countries to enter its sphere of influence. Its first real victory is in 1982, where Hafiz al-Assad of Syria reaches out to Khomeini for legitimation. Hafiz al-Assad is worried as an Alawite that he might not be seen as legitimate by the 70+% of his population who are Sunni Muslim. And while that population will accept Alawites in the government, they won't accept an Alawite as their supreme leader. And Khomeini gives Hafiz al-Assad the justification that he is actually part of 12er Shiite Islam and therefore a legitimate Muslim. But even more than that, Iran begins an expansionist policy of trying to project power in other places in the Middle East. And the first method of power projection that they use outside of trying to meet with government leaders is to create their own militias. They intervene indirectly in Lebanon through the creation of Hezbollah, a jihadist organization that fielded its own paramilitaries, led by Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah and based in Lebanon. Of course, this was in the middle of the Lebanese Civil War, which was from 1975 to 1991. And through its actions in the war, Hezbollah began to command a significant loyalty of Lebanese Shiites and begin to show what it would look like once you had Shiites in political power. We also saw Iran have to prosecute the Iran-Iraq War, which Iraq declared against it. And this created within Iran the development of war doctrines, Islamic war doctrines actually being implemented, things like declaring the war against Iraq a jihad. You see this expansionism on the Iranian side as a direct result of their revolutionary philosophy. As we mentioned, the Mujahideen are successful, and the new regime of the Taliban is instituted in Afghanistan. Now, there's a few things to point out here. First is that the Taliban government was a complete zero in the human rights department. We see women being forced to wear burqa, where they can't expose even their face. They're not allowed to go to school. They can have acid thrown in their faces for violating the will of their husband, a number of other rights issues. There are also human rights issues for minority populations. There aren't that many religious minorities in Afghanistan, but those that do exist are thoroughly repressed, including the Jews and some Christian converts. There's also an incredibly strong iconoclasm, resulting in the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan. One of the things that surprises a lot of people, that should be 2001, not 2021. But one of the things that surprises a lot of people is that Afghanistan was a majority Buddhist country before the arrival of Islam. And so there is a long tradition of Buddhist statues that existed, especially in areas like Bamyan. The Taliban saw these things as idolatrous, and in their religious iconoclasm, they blew them up. But aside from these, the most interesting thing from a governmental or philosophical perspective is that they charted a new course for Islamism. Up to this point, most Islamist groups had been pan-Islamist. They had seen all Muslims as being part of a large Islamic nation that was artificially separated and eventually would be reunited, but what simply was divided by those borders because of the present political circumstances. The Taliban actually changed the script and declared themselves effectively as a national Islamist group. They believed in a Muslim unifying identity. They believed in that government should be a legislation of Islamic law as the law of a modern nation state, but they rejected the idea that all the Muslims were their future conquests. They believed that they had something tied to their ethnic home, their national home of Afghanistan and parts of what is today Pakistan, as being the areas under their future purview. They had no interest, for example, in entering into Turkmenistan or Iran or any other country. They simply saw it as outside. And this creates a new relationship that the Taliban could begin to structure with outside parties, because unlike pan-Islamist individuals, they had no completing claims with the territorial integrity of other states. One last thing that I want to cover before we get to questions, and we'll continue the rest of this next week, is the Algerian Civil War. Now, the Algerian Civil War is when the Islamists won at the ballot box. This was not an armed insurrection, as happened with the Taliban. It was not a revolution, as happened with Iran. This was that the Islamic Salvation Front, the Front Islamique de Salvation, won 47% of the vote, more than any other political party, certainly more than the National Liberation Front, la Front Libération Nationale, which was the independence government in Algeria. They won more than twice the votes of that party. And so they would come to power. But the generals in the military refused to honor the results, refused to allow the Islamic Salvation Front, the Islamist political party, to come to power. And it resulted in a massive civil war in Algeria from 1991 to 2002. The secularists managed to hold power by engaging in numerous massacres throughout the country. It's estimated that 130,000 people have died in numerous massacres, and the legitimacy of the Algerian government was called into question simply because it refused to permit the actual results of an election to happen. All right. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat, and I will explain a little bit about who we are. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard. I host the Middle Eastern Islamic History group on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. There's also the Asian Philosophy group that meets on Saturdays. Aaron and I periodically do a European Union security presentation. There is a episode of The Dead Languages this Saturday by John Maloney on the ancient Hebrew language as opposed to modern Hebrew. Jane recently did a series on Agrippina the Younger for Powerful Women, and we'll have another episode in a month. And we also have our short-run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War series that we'll pick up in a few months. And we just did our tour of India for the Islamic city tours with Nurul. And of course, we have our older series that you can see on our YouTube page for medieval and modern Europe, ancient Greece, history of sports, history of technologies, Jewish history, all these different kinds of things. So, questions, comments, clarifications? To the question of Indonesia, if we can go back to that a little bit, Indonesia has had a lot of difficulty with Islamism, particularly in Aceh, as I pointed out. They have their own Islamist government. But most of the leaders of Indonesia have been relatively secular in terms of their political orientation. And that has caused some problems. That said, with Islamists, especially as more and more Indonesians have received education in Saudi Arabia, right? That's part of the Saudi investment piece. Hopefully, Indonesia will be able to remain secular, but it's always a question of how are the trends moving and what do people see? One of the things that I tried to point out is that a lot of the success of Islamists isn't just that they appeal to personal piety, which some of them certainly do, but because the populations that they find are also in difficult economic circumstances. And the Islamists claim that the reason that they're in those desperate economic situations is exactly because they've embraced secular political systems. If they had the corrective influence of religion, then things would improve. Of course, the economics arguments don't quite fall in line with this, but it's not as if most of the populations that they're courting are the ones that are going to go on websites and do a comparative analysis of this kind of thing. Considering no other questions, I'm going to close this out and we will pick up with this next Wednesday. And then we will continue on to the discussion of Israeli history, which will take us through the next 2 weeks, where we go through what has happened since the Independence War in 1948 all the way until the present time. All right. See everybody next week.